Everyone at the reception heard my daughter say it. This is what happens when you let old men plan parties, Dad. You embarrass yourself, and you embarrass me. Her husband didn't even look up from his phone while she said it, and 30 feet away, my grandson watched me kneel in spilled champagne and shattered glass, his face caught somewhere between wanting to help me up and being told, without a single word, not to. I picked up the pieces of the anniversary gift I'd spent 4 months building by hand. I said nothing. I smiled at the guests, still watching. And I drove home that night already knowing exactly which phone call I was going to make in the morning. Thank you for being here with me today. Before we go any further, I'd love it if you'd tell me in the comments where you're joining from. I read every single one, and it means more to me than you know to picture all of you out there listening tonight. Welcome back, friends. One quick note before we begin. This story contains fictional elements written for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental, but I hope the lesson underneath it stays with you. My name is Walter Pruitt, and I am 68 years old. I want to tell you what happened on the second Saturday of October in a rented banquet hall outside Asheville, North Carolina, at my daughter's 40th wedding anniversary party, a party I paid for. In a hall I booked, celebrating a marriage I had watched from the very beginning, back when her husband was a nervous 24-year-old sitting at my kitchen table, asking me, hands shaking around a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking, whether he had my blessing. I gave it to him. I have never once regretted giving it to him. What I regret, and what I've had a long time now to sit with, is not seeing sooner what that blessing would eventually cost me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, the way I always do, because I think a story only makes sense if you understand the quiet years before the loud one. My wife's name was Margaret. She passed 6 years ago this past January, and there isn't a morning that goes by that I don't reach for her side of the bed before I remember. We had 2 children, my daughter Renata and my son Cole, who lives out in Sacramento now with his own family and calls me every single Sunday evening, without fail, rain or shine, deployment, or vacation, 6 years running. I want you to remember that about Cole. It matters later. Renata was always the bright one, valedictorian, full scholarship to Wake Forest. She married a man named Preston Halloway the summer after she graduated, and I liked him from the start, quiet, a little unsure of himself, working an entry-level position at a regional logistics company that, back then, had exactly 40 employees and a single warehouse the size of a high school gymnasium. I was a structural engineer for 38 years. I built bridges. I built overpasses. I built the kind of things that people drive across every day of their lives without ever once wondering who made sure they wouldn't fall down. It's a good trade for a quiet man. You learn to measure twice, cut once, and keep your opinions to yourself unless someone's actually asking for them. In the spring of 2007, Preston came to me with a business plan. He wanted to expand the logistics company, buy out 2 smaller competitors, modernize the fleet, get into cold storage distribution before anyone else in the region did. It was a good plan. I could see that immediately. What he didn't have was capital, and what the banks were offering him, in the shape they were in, after the crash hit that fall, wasn't going to be nearly enough. I had just cashed out a pension from 31 years with the State Highway Department. Margaret and I had talked about a smaller house, maybe a camper, maybe finally seeing the Grand Canyon like we always said we would. Instead, I sat across the kitchen table from my son-in-law and told him I wanted to invest $410,000 into his company. He cried. I remember that clearly because I don't think I'd seen a grown man cry at my kitchen table since my own father passed. He said he'd pay every cent back, with interest, on whatever terms I wanted. I told him I didn't want interest. I told him I wanted one thing only, that the investment be structured properly, on paper, the way any responsible business arrangement should be, rather than as a handshake between family that could get messy later, if anything ever went sideways. He agreed to everything. What he didn't fully understand, because I never explained it to him in plain terms, and because my attorney, a sharp, careful woman named Dolores Kwan, who had handled my affairs since the late 90s, structured it the way she structured everything, meaning thoroughly, was that the investment wasn't a loan at all. It was an equity stake, a significant one. 44% held through a private trust in my name, with voting rights attached, Filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State the same spring the company took my money. I told Preston it was a loan because that's what he needed to hear to accept it without feeling like he'd handed away a piece of what he'd built. And, in every meaningful sense, it was his company. He grew it. He made the decisions, took the risks, worked the 80-hour weeks while Renata held the household together and raised their son, my grandson Milo, more or less on her own for the better part of a decade. I never once involved myself in day-to-day operations. Dolores structured the trust specifically so that Preston retained full operational control. I wasn't trying to run his company. I was trying to make sure that if the worst ever happened, if he got sick, if the marriage fell apart, if some outside partner ever tried to squeeze him out, there would be a wall standing between my daughter's family and disaster, and nobody but Dolores and I would ever need to know it was there. By 2018, Halloway Regional Logistics had grown into the third largest distribution company in the Western Carolinas, 210 employees, contracts with 3 grocery chains and a pharmaceutical distributor. Preston's face was on a billboard off Interstate 40 that said, in letters 6 feet tall, built from nothing, a local success story. I drove past that billboard once a week for 2 years and never said a word about it to anyone. Some things you let people have. A man's pride is a fragile scaffold, and I had spent my whole career learning not to knock at load-bearing walls unless I had a very good reason. I should tell you about the party, because that's where all of this starts to turn. It was supposed to be a celebration, 40 years of marriage, and Renata had asked me, 3 months earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad full of notes, whether I would help plan it. I said, of course. I spent those 3 months the way I spend most of my time these days, with my hands busy. I have a woodworking shop out in the garage that used to be Margaret's parking spot, and I built, over the course of about 4 months of evenings, a cedar chest, hand-jointed, no nails, the lid inlaid with a compass rose, because Preston had always talked about wanting to travel more once the business settled down. I filled it with 40 years of photographs I'd spent that same stretch of time scanning and printing, going all the way back to their wedding day, when Preston sat shaking at my kitchen table, asking for my blessing. I also, without telling anyone, paid for the entire event. The hall, the caterer, the band. $68,000, quietly transferred from an account Dolores and I had set up specifically so that nobody at the party would ever need to know where the money came from. I didn't want thanks. I wanted my daughter to have a beautiful night and never once think about the cost. The party was lovely for the first 2 hours. String lights, a live jazz trio, Preston's business partners, and half the Western Carolina business community mingling with old family friends. My grandson Milo, 22 now, tall and gentle-eyed like his mother, standing near the gift table, looking uncertain in the particular way young people look when they can sense tension in a room before the adults around them have admitted it exists. I was carrying the cedar chest toward the gift table myself. I'd insisted on that. I wanted to place it there personally when my daughter's new daughter-in-law, a woman I'll call by her name, Kendra, who had married Milo's older cousin the previous spring and had appointed herself, without anyone asking, as the evening's unofficial coordinator, stepped directly into my path to redirect a server carrying a tray of champagne. I don't believe, even now, that what happened next was fully deliberate on her part. I want to be fair about that, but she turned sharply. Her elbow caught the edge of the chest, and the chest tipped from my hands and struck the corner of the gift table on its way down. The lid split along one of the joints I'd cut myself. A dozen champagne flutes went down with it, shattering across the hardwood floor in a sound that stopped every conversation in that hall at once. I went down on one knee to gather the broken pieces of something I'd spent 4 months building, glass biting into my palm before I even registered the sting of it. And that is the moment Renata's voice cut across the room. This is what happens when you let old men plan parties, Dad. You embarrass yourself, and you embarrass me. I want you to understand I have forgiven my daughter a great many things over the years, the way any parent learns to. Sharp words said in stress. A slammed door in her teenage years. This one, I'll admit to you honestly, took me longer. Preston didn't look up from his phone. I don't believe he even fully registered what she'd said, which somehow hurt in its own separate way that after everything, he didn't think it was worth glancing up for. Milo started forward. I saw him start forward, Half a step, hand already reaching, and Kendra quick, quiet, a single hand on his forearm stopped him before he'd gotten anywhere. He looked at her. He looked at me. He stayed where he was. I picked up the broken chest myself. I collected the shattered glass into a napkin with my bleeding hand. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and smiled at the 60 or 70 guests who were still watching me the way you watch an accident you can't quite look away from. I said something about clumsy old hands and asked the band to keep playing. And then I found a quiet corner near the coat check, wrapped my palm in a handkerchief that had been my wife's pale blue stitching, her initials, M.P., worn nearly through at the corners. From 18 years of me carrying it in my breast pocket, out of habit, I never examined too closely, and I sat there for 11 minutes doing absolutely nothing at all except breathing. Then I drove home. I didn't cry, if that's what you're picturing. I want to be honest with you, the way I try to be honest in every one of these stories. What I felt, sitting in my truck in that empty parking lot with my hand throbbing under the handkerchief, wasn't grief exactly. It was clarity. The particular, cold clarity of a man who has just watched a wall he'd assumed was load-bearing get treated like drywall, and understood, finally, that it was time to find out what was actually holding the structure up. I let myself into the house a little after 11. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Preston once asked for my blessing with shaking hands, and I called Dolores Kwan's after-hours line, which she had given me 11 years earlier, and told me, only half joking, to use exactly once in my lifetime, for exactly the kind of situation that would actually warrant it. She picked up on the third ring. I told her what happened. There was a long pause on her end, long enough that I almost asked if the call had dropped. "Walter," she finally said, "do you want to know what I think, or do you want to know what your options are?" "Both," I said. "But start with the options." I should back up again, just for a moment, because I don't think the rest of this makes sense without one more piece of context. 3 weeks before the party, my grandson Milo had called me not on a Sunday, which was unusual, and not for long, which was more unusual still. He was quiet on the phone in a way that didn't sound like him. "Grandpa," he said, "can I ask you something weird?" "Always," I told him. "Does Dad actually own the whole company? Like, all of it?" I felt something tighten low in my chest, the particular tightening you feel when a question arrives that you've spent a long time hoping nobody would ever need to ask. "Why do you ask that, bud?" "I don't know." Kendra was talking to her dad on speakerphone in the kitchen, and I walked in, and she hung up real fast. But before she did, I heard her say something like, "Once Preston steps back, the restructuring basically writes itself, and I don't know what that means, but it sounded, I don't know. It sounded like they were planning something." I told him it was probably nothing. "Business talk," I said. "People say strange things about companies they don't fully understand." I told him not to worry about it, and I told myself, in that same breath, that I was probably right. I was not right. I understand that now. Kendra's father, it turned out, and this took Dolores less than a day to confirm, because it turns out very little in the business world of a mid-sized North Carolina city stays hidden for long. Once you know exactly where to look, was a private equity consultant named Marcus Feld who specialized in exactly one thing: identifying founder-led companies where the founder's personal life had grown fragile enough to create an opening, and engineering what he called, in an email Dolores's investigator later obtained through entirely legal means, a values-based leadership transition. In plainer language, he had spent 4 months building a case, quietly, among select members of Halloway Regional Logistics Board of Advisors, that Preston was erratic, distracted, unfit to lead the company through its next phase of expansion, a case built substantially on carefully selected stories about his father-in-law, meaning me, an aging, increasingly unstable presence whose continued involvement in family finances was, in Marcus Feld's written words, a governance liability the board should address directly. The plan, as best as Dolores and I were able to piece it together afterward, was elegant in its cruelty. Stage a public embarrassment, something small, something deniable, something that would look, to 300 witnesses, exactly like what it appeared to be, an old man's clumsy accident at a party. Let Renata's own frustration, real and understandable and years in the making from watching her father slowly recede into quiet grief since her mother passed, do the rest of the work publicly, in front of Preston's business associates, several of whom sat on that board of advisors themselves. Plant the narrative, let it grow on its own. Then, within the month, present the board with a family stability concern that would make Preston's continued unquestioned authority look, suddenly, like the reckless choice rather than the responsible one, clearing a path for Marcus Feld's firm to be brought in as an interim operational partner, a role that came, Dolores discovered, with a contractual pathway to acquiring a controlling stake within 18 months. They did not know about the trust. That was the piece nobody outside myself and Dolores had ever known existed. 44%, held quietly for 17 years, structured specifically so that no outside party, however patient, however well-connected, could ever simply walk in and take the company out from under the family that had actually built it. Walter, Dolores said to me that night on the phone, you have three options. You can do nothing and let this play out and hope the board sees through it, which, I'll be honest with you, is a coin flip at best, given what Feld has apparently spent months constructing. You can call Preston tonight and tell him everything, which protects him immediately, but also means having a conversation you've spent 17 years choosing not to have. Or, I said, or you let me handle it exactly the way we structured it to be handled, 17 years ago, for precisely this kind of situation. Quietly, through the proper channels. And you let the truth do what truth generally does when it's finally allowed into a room. I thought about Margaret and the way she used to say that the strongest thing a person could do wasn't always the loudest thing. I thought about my handkerchief, soaked through with my own blood in a coat check closet, while 60 people watched a jazz trio play like nothing had happened. I thought about Milo's voice on the phone 3 weeks earlier, careful and scared, in a way 22-year-olds shouldn't have to sound about their own family. Do it the right way, I told her, quietly, through the proper channels, but do it now. Dolores requested an emergency session of the Board of Advisors for the following Thursday, 5 days after the party, citing informal legal language, undisclosed material conflicts of interest, and an outside party's attempt to solicit board members using materially false representations about the ownership structure of the company. She attached, as exhibits, the 17-year-old trust filing, notarized and on record with the state the entire time, publicly searchable by anyone who had thought to actually look. I did not tell Renata. I did not tell Preston. I drove up to Asheville that Thursday morning, alone, in the same tweed jacket I'd worn to the party. Margaret had picked that jacket out, years ago, told me it made my shoulders look like they still had some fight left in them, and I sat in the hallway outside the conference room while Dolores presented 17 years of documentation to 11 board members who had, until that morning, been operating on the assumption that Preston Halloway had built his company entirely on his own, and that his aging father-in-law was, at best, an irrelevant presence to be managed around. Preston was not in that room. He'd been asked to wait outside, same as me, on the instructions of the board's outside counsel, given the nature of what was being presented. I found him sitting 3 chairs down from me in that hallway, tie loosened, staring at the closed conference room door like it might open onto something that was going to end his life as he currently understood it. He didn't know I was there for almost 4 minutes. When he finally turned and saw me, his face did something complicated, surprise, then confusion, then something that looked almost like fear, though I didn't understand yet what he thought I might be there to do. "Walter," he said, "what's going on? Nobody will tell me anything. Some guy named Feld keeps texting me that I need to trust him, that the board's been—" He stopped. He looked at me harder. "Wait, do you know something? Is this about you? Are you okay? Is this about your hand?" I looked down. I hadn't realized the bandage was still visible below my shirt cuff. "Preston," I said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 17 years ago." I told him everything, right there in that hallway, in maybe 6 minutes, in the plainest language I had. The trust, the 44%, the reason I'd called it a loan instead of what it actually was. And then, because he deserved the whole picture and not just the comfortable half of it, I told him what Marcus Feld had actually been building toward and whose father he happened to be. Preston went very still, then very pale. Then he said, in a voice I'd never heard him use in 17 years of knowing him, "Kendra's dad did this?" Kendra knew? I don't know exactly what Kendra knew. I told him honestly, because I didn't. Not for certain, not yet. But I know what her father was building, and I know it was built on the assumption that nobody would ever find out I was standing behind you the whole time. He put his face in both hands. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet, and he wasn't hiding it, which told me something about the kind of man he still was underneath 17 years of billboards and boardrooms. You've owned almost half my company since before Milo could walk, he said. And you never once. I never once needed to, I said. You built it. Every hour of it. Every decision. Every risk. The money was mine. The company is yours. I only ever wanted there to be a floor underneath you in case somebody ever tried what somebody just tried. The conference room door opened 40 minutes later. The board's chairwoman, a measured, silver-haired woman named Adrienne Voss, who had served on 3 other regional boards and had a reputation, Dolores told me once, for being nearly impossible to rattle, stepped out and asked us both to come in. What followed was not dramatic, not in the way you might expect from a story like this. There was no shouting. Marcus Feld, it turned out, had not been invited to the session at all. He had no standing to be there, a detail that seemed to surprise him considerably when Adrienne Voss called him, on speakerphone, in front of the full board, to inform him that his firm's proposed advisory arrangement was being declined and that the board would be referring the matter of his solicitation of members using false ownership representations to outside counsel for review. Kendra, it emerged over the following days, through a conversation Renata finally had with Milo, and eventually with me, had known more than she'd admitted, though less, I came to believe, than her father. She had wanted her husband's family to be seen as more accomplished, more secure than she felt they currently were, and her father had offered her a path toward that, in language that made it sound, to her, like help rather than what it actually was. I don't say this to excuse her. I say it because I've found, over 68 years, that most of the damage people do to their families comes less from cruelty than from a kind of desperate, misdirected wanting, an understanding that doesn't erase the harm, but it does make it possible to eventually sit at the same table again. Renata called me that same evening. I could hear, before she even said a word, that she'd been crying for a while. "Dad," she said, "is it true? All of it?" "Every word," I said. "Why didn't you ever tell me you basically saved his company from a hostile takeover before it even happened? Why didn't you tell me any of it?" "Because I didn't want you carrying the weight of it," I told her. "I wanted you to have a good marriage and a good life, and not spend one single day of either wondering whether your father's money was the reason any of it worked. That was mine to carry, not yours." There was a long silence on the line. Then she said, quiet, in a voice that sounded like the one she used to use as a little girl climbing into my lap after a nightmare, "I said something terrible to you at the party, in front of everyone, and you just took it. You didn't even—" "I know what you said," I told her. "I've thought about it a great deal since. I want you to know I understand where it came from. You've been holding that family together with both hands since your mother passed, mostly alone, and I think some nights the weight of that finds its way out, sideways, at whoever's closest, whether they deserve it or not. I forgave you the moment I stood back up off that floor, Renata. I want you to hear that clearly. I forgave you before I even got to my truck." She cried for a long time after that. I let her. Some conversations don't need you to fill every silence. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon that had turned unexpectedly warm for late October, Preston and Renata drove out to my house together, along with Milo, and they brought with them the cedar chest repaired now, the split joint carefully re-glued and clamped by Preston himself, who it turns out spent 2 evenings in his own garage, teaching himself woodworking from videos just to fix what he'd watched break. We sat on my back porch, the same porch Margaret used to sit on every evening with a cup of tea, watching the light change over the tree line the way she loved. Milo sat next to me and didn't say much, but he leaned his shoulder against mine the way he used to when he was small, and that was enough. Preston set the repaired chest on the table between us and said he was sorry, properly sorry, not for the accident itself, which none of us fully believed was entirely an accident anymore, but for 17 years of never once asking me the real story behind a check that changed his entire life. "You could have told me," he said, "any time. I would have understood." "I know," I said, "but some things a father doesn't explain, He just quietly makes sure they hold. Renata reached over and took my bandaged hand, careful of the stitches, and held it the way she used to hold it crossing the street when she was 6 years old, and the world still felt like something I could fully protect her from. I looked out at the tree line the way Margaret used to, and I thought about something she told me once, years before she got sick, when I was worried about some small slight from a colleague at work and couldn't let it go. She said that real strength was never about being loud enough to win an argument in the moment. It was about being steady enough to still be standing, unchanged and unembittered, long after the moment had passed and the truth had finally caught up to it. I think about that a great deal these days. I think that what happened in that banquet hall wasn't really about a broken chest or a cruel sentence said in front of strangers, or even about the money, though the money mattered in its own quiet way. It was about the difference between two kinds of strength, the kind that needs an audience, needs applause, needs somebody smaller to stand on to feel tall, and the kind that simply keeps showing up, keeps building, keeps holding the floor steady underneath the people you love, whether or not they ever know you're the one doing it. I don't regret the years of silence. But if I'm honest with you, the way I try to be honest in every story I tell here, I regret that it took a shattered chest and a bleeding hand for my daughter to finally understand how much I'd been carrying quietly on her behalf the whole time. If I had it to do over, I think I'd tell her sooner, not to be thanked, just so she'd never have to wonder. That's the whole story, friends. If it stirred something in you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet strength is still strength. And if you'd like more stories like this one about fathers, about family, about the kind of love that never needs to raise its voice to be real, stay close, subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Thank you for staying with me until the very last word tonight. It means more than you know.